All right, Rabbi, say good morning and a good night. Let us begin. I'm going to begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank all of our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nissan, Jerry and Abby Applebaum, in memory of Basia Bas Chaim and David Ben Avram, Doctors Paul and Linda Weinberg, in memory of Mordechai Yehoshua ben Peretz Moshe Miriam, Paul and Kathy Pollack, and zchus refuah sheileimah for Donna Baker-Matson, Steve and Teri Czinn, with gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for their new grandson, Bunim Tzvi Hersch Czinn, Naftali Tilson, with Akaras Atov to his good chaver Benjamin Wohl, and with wishes for a Chag Kasher V'Sameach to the entire shir, and Avraham Shaindy Kelman in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Sara Braina bas Yehoshua Heschel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, and we thank all of our sponsors for their incredible generosity. And also with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Dalid, and we are picking up Emirat Hashem on the bottom of Mem Gimel days 43b at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says as follows: Arba achin nisuin arba noshim. 4 brothers are married to 4 sisters. And I will say, so again, this is going back. I'm sorry, I take that back. 4 brothers married to 4 women, not 4 sisters. Umeisu, and they died. Now again, we'll discuss the exact parameters of this case in the Mishnah. They died. In Ratza Gadol Shebahem Liyabemes Kulam Harashus Biyado. If the oldest brother, so we're going to see, the Gemara is going to question, I'll give you this now just to allow the Mishnah to make sense. It sounds like you have 4 brothers married to 4 women, and all of the brothers died. Obviously, if all of the brothers died, then what? Then there's no yibum. So obviously the case in question is you have 4 brothers and 3 out of the 4 brothers died, or 5 brothers and 4 brothers died. The idea over here is that 1 surviving brother is left with 4 widows. Now understand, I will say, this is what I said, this is an uncomplicated case. Because remember again, these 4 women are unrelated to one another, and therefore technically speaking, the surviving brother technically has 4 different mitzvos of yibum in front of him. So therefore, again, the Mishnah says, "In Ratzagol Shem Liyabim Es Kulan Harushus Biyado." If the surviving brother wants to do yibum with all of them, so therefore, again, he's going to have 4 new wives, 4 new mitzvos of yibum. He has the right to do so. Misha Hayar Nasu L'Shtein Nashim Umeis. If a man was married to 2 women and then he died. So I will say, so then back to another classic case. Reuven passes away. Reuven is married to 2 women, Rachel and Leah. But Rachel and Leah are unrelated to one another. They're co-wives, right? They're tsaros, but they're unrelated to one another. So now what happens? These 2 women fall to Shimon in Yibum. What's the halacha? Bi'aso chalitzasa shel achas mehen poteres tsarasa. So ultimately, Yibum or chalitza with one of these women goes ahead and exempts the other woman from anything. I will say, this is actually a fascinating Mishnah. Why is this fascinating? Where does it feel like this Mishnah belongs? In the beginning of the Masechta, right? It's just, sometimes it's just so fascinating the way Rebbe don't say put together the Mishnah. It's like we've been dealing with such intricate and complicated cases, and let's be honest. When I read Arba Achin this morning, when I said those words, you tensed up. I saw it in your body language. Like, oh no. It's Chalamayid. I was feeling good. Things were going well. And now Arba Achin. And it's incredible. So it's fascinating. So what is the Mishnah illustrating to me? The Mishnah is illustrating to me a simple, almost like a simple Yibum case of 4 brothers passing away, 4 unrelated wives, 1 surviving brother now being faced with 4 independent mitzvos of Yibum. And the Mishnah says, okay, if you want to do 4 mitzvos of Yibum, you want to marry 4 women, marry 4 women. Simple case. Another simple case, Reuven married to 2 women, unrelated to one another, except now the fact that they're co-wives. Reuven dies, both of those women fall to Shimon to Yibum. What is the Mishnah teaching me? It's either Yibum or Chalitza with what? With one of them. But because they are looked at as a unit, as a cohort, you can't do Yibum or Chalitza with both. In other words, you have to go ahead and choose which wife you're going to do Yibum and Chalitza, and that takes care of the marital unit. So the Gemara says, top of Mem Dalid, Haisa achas kshera v'achas psula. So we'll say along these same lines. Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah. Reuven passes away. Rachel and Leah now fall to Yibum to Shimon. So halacha number 1 is Shimon. Decide which wife, Rachel or Leah, you want to do Yibum or Chalitza with, and taking care of this with one wife exempts the co-wife. What happens if Rachel, right, Achas Shevach Psula? Let's say between Rachel and Leah, one of them was Kshera, we call it, and one of them was Psula. We'll say, just to give you a simple example, these Kshera and Psula cases are designations vis-a-vis who? The kahuna. So simple example. Let's say when Rachel married Reuven, she was divorced. This is Rachel's second marriage, or her marriage to Reuven was her second marriage. So she was a grusha. A divorcee. As a divorcee, she was already what? Precluded from marrying into the kahuna. So now let's assume over here in this case, Shimon is not going to do Yibum. Shimon's going to do Chalitza. So what does the Mishnah say? If you're going to be doing Chalitza anyway, do low impact Chalitza. Right? What's low impact Chalitza? Remember again, a Chalitza is not permitted to go ahead and marry a Kohen. So if you're going to do Chalitza anyway, do Chalitza with who? With who? With Rachel. Right? This way, because Rachel's already a grusha. So therefore, making her a Chalutza doesn't really have any material impact on her status. As opposed to doing Chalitza with Leah, so halacha l'maisa, then what you're doing is you're taking her status from an almana, changing her to a chalutza, which now precludes her from marrying into the kahuna. Now, obviously, if Shimon wants to do yibum, when it comes to yibum, I will say, it's interesting. As opposed to the yibum chalitza obligation, which devolves upon the oldest brother, if you've noticed, one thing we haven't seen is an order of precedence between the wives for, let's say, Yibum. Right? There's no such concept, for example, that the wife the deceased brother married first, is the ideal candidate for Yibum. Rather, again, who does the surviving brother do Yibum with? If he's going to do Yibum, what does he do it with? Whoever he chooses. So Lamaisa, this is talking about, so obviously if Shimon wants to do Yibum, he could do Yibum with whoever he wants. Again, then we get back into the machlokes of Abashon, the Rabbanon, whether or not one requires purity of intent for the mitzvah. But Lamaisa, if you're going to go ahead and do Chalitza, so the Mishnah says, do Chalitza with the least, we'll call it the least impact, low impact Chalitza. To which the Gemara says, miyabim l'kshera. Now this is interesting. The Mishnah says, if you're going to do Yibum with the kshera. Now I will say, we'll discuss exactly what this means. Right, so halacha l'maisa. If you're going to do yibum, so do yibum with the one who is kshera. I will say now, kshira in this context would sound like what? Would sound like Leah, right? Because she's not the grusha from the previous marriage, but we'll see what that means. Says the Gemara, arba achin slachet. I gave this away a little bit because it was hard to read the Mishnah without kind of giving this away. Remember, what is the Mishnah bothered by? The way when you read the case of the Mishnah, it sounds like there are 4 brothers married to 4 women, and 4 brothers die. Okay, well, if that's the case, then what? Then there's no yibum because everyone has passed away. To which the Gemara says, sheileimah arba me'achin. Rather, we'll say the way to read the Mishnah is you have a large child, we'll call it 5 brothers. And 4 of the 5 brothers passed away, and there is 1 surviving brother for a yibum. Okay, so the Mishnah, so harushus biyado, suppose what did the Mishnah say? Saloch l'maisa, if the surviving brother wants to marry all 4 women, if he wants to marry all 4, he wants to do Yibum 4 times, Harushus Biyada, ultimately, he has the right and he has the ability to do so. So says the Gemara, V'shaf Gilei, do we let him do that? I'm sorry, I'm saying one moment here. V'shaf Gilei, will we actually allow him to do that? Says the Gemara, Vatanya, we learned, this is fascinating. I will say, again, what's so exciting about this Gemara is, like I said, it feels like all of this should be on Daf Beis, because it's really, look, watch. V'shafki, the Gemara says, will we let surviving brother marry 4 women? V'atanya, we learned, v'karlo ziknei ha'ir. So we'll say, the Gemara now is going to dissect the pasuk by Yibum / Chalitza. So the pasuk over here that we're talking about is, v'karlo ziknei ha'ir, the elders of the city will call the surviving brother, v'dibro elav, they will speak with him, v'amad v'amar lo chafatzti lekachta, and ultimately, again, he will say, I do not want to take her. So the pasuk over here is we're talking about chalitza. So listen to this. V'karu lo ziknei ha'ir, they will call to him the elders of the city. Hein v'lo shluchan. So we'll say, what's the halacha? It has to be the beis din that calls out to the yavam, and not the agents of the beis din. So in other words, when it comes to the yavam, they have to be going ahead and speaking to him directly. Okay, v'dibrei lav, they will speak with him. Melamid shemasino eitza hogenes. So we'll say, this is fascinating. Beis din gives the yavam advice. The beis din tries to advise the yavam as to what is the best course of action. For example, Shimhu yelad v'hi zekena. We'll say, let's say the surviving brother is young, and the yavama, the widow, is old, or hu zaken v'hi yalda, or he's very old and she's very young. Omrim lo, we say to the yavam, ma lecha eitza yalda, ma lecha eitza zekena. We say to the yavam, ultimately again, come on, this marriage is not going. What possibility do you have to build a relationship with this woman? Right? She's much older than you. She's much younger than you. So we'll say this is fascinating. So we see that beis din really gets involved with the yavam to try to guide him in making the right direction. That if beis din looks and they say, you know what, this is not a shidduch, right? This is not really a marriage. That's great. It's true that in this context is a mitzvah of yibum, but this is not a relationship that has a chance of real success. We tell him, you know what, maybe for you in this situation, better to do chalitza. So the Gemara says, Somalecha eitza zkena, kelecha eitza shekmoscha, ve'al tosim ketata beveisecha. You know what, you're better off finding a woman who's more similar to you, and do not create fighting, kitata, or friction in your home. In other words, so the beis din says to him, come on, this is just not a good idea. So the Gemara will say, so therefore again, why is the Gemara bringing this up? And we'll say, bepashtos, in this kind of case, can you imagine, where we'll call him Zvulun, right? Zvulun shows up in beis din, and his brothers Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda all passed away. Right, and now he's faced with 4 widows. So Zvulun has always been a very idealistic guy. He shows up in beis din, he's like, let's go, right? Let's do this, right? For Yevamos, mamish, I can't wait, all of the mitzvahs, this is beautiful. You remember what it's like to be so idealistic and wonderful, right? So the Gemara says, bepashtos, what beis din tell him? Zvulun, calm down. Right, calm down. Right. This is not a good idea. Right, this is not going to work out well. So yet the Mishnah seems to say, like, listen, if Zvulun wants to marry all 4 women, marry all 4 women. I said, really, would we allow Zvulun to marry 4 women? Is this a good idea? In any universe, is this a good idea? To which the Gemara said, Lo tzricha de'af shalei. So the Gemara supposed to say, interestingly enough, the Gemara seems to frame this much more as like a financial consideration, right? Like, is it possible that Zvulun is going to have the means now to support 4 women? To which the Gemara says, yeah, maybe he does. Right? Rashi says, Ashirhu, he's a rich guy, and therefore no problem. To which the Gemara says, afilu tuba nami. If that's the case, so why stop at 4? Why doesn't the Mishnah go ahead and mention 10 brothers, right? If he's got plenty of money, and money is not a problem, say even frame more. So this is actually very interesting. So we'll say the Mishnah is actually teaching us something very interesting, which is that halacha l'maisa, 4 would really be the maximum number that beis din would ever realistically allow a man to take in yibum. Why? Assuming he has the money to do so. Ki heichi denimtie ona b'chodesh. Because you'll both say, halacha l'maisa, a man has an obligation to maintain a normal, intimate relationship with his wife. And at a certain point in time, if there's too many women, he's going to be derelict in that responsibility. So the Gemara points out over here, up to 4 wives, a man could potentially fulfill his intimate obligations. But l'maisa, more than that, he would not be able to. Now, let's say there's a whole discussion over here, because the way the Gemara seems to frame this, it's really quite fascinating, is that halacha l'maisa, look at Rashi, ona b'chodesh, Onisha Talmud Chacham Erev Shabbos li Erev Shabbos. We'll say Talmud Chacham has an obligation to be intimate at least once a week with his wife. So it's interesting over here is, the Gemara, let's say he's a Talmud Chacham, if he has an obligation to be intimate with his wife once a week, and there are 4 wives, that ensures that he's with each wife once a month. Which I will say is very strange, because the mitzvah of, the way the Gemara is seeming to frame it over here is, the mitzvah of Ona is looked at through the view of the man. The man has an obligation of intimacy once a week, and therefore if there are 4 wives, 1 wife a week, so say, everyone argues on this Rashi, because Masha brings this down, or the Rush brings this down, because the mitzvah of Ona is usually looked at through the lens of the woman, right? Not through the lens of the man. The obligation is upon the man, but the level of frequency of intimacy depends on a lot of things. Depends on the profession of the man. All right, not a topic for now. The point that I want you to take from this is that halacha l'maisa, which is really fascinating, is when the guy shows up in Beis Din to do yibum, Beis Din gives him eitzah hogeneslo. Beis Din gives him unsolicited marital advice about what he should be doing. Is this a yibum situation, a chalitza situation? Good. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So remember, the next case in the Mishnah was, Reuven was married to 2 women, Rachel and Leah, unrelated to each other, but Saros, co-wives to one another. Reuven passes away. Now both of these women fall to Shimon. So what do we say? So what happens? What's the halacha? Shimon does yibum or chalitza with one of the 2. Says the Gemara, V'niyabim l'tarvayhu. Well, I don't understand why. Why can't you do yibum with both women? In other words, why it's fascinating. I'm sorry? He just did it with 4. Correct. Now, obviously, we know the answer. We know the distinction is that he did it with 4 from 4 different brothers, right? But essentially, that's what the Gemara is asking over here. That Lamaisa, I don't understand why can't you do? Why can't Shimon marry both widows of Reuven? What's the problem? Asher lo yivne es beis ochiv. We'll say the pasuk over here, interestingly enough, is once again talking about chalitza, but the lashon of the pasuk is the brother does chalitza is someone who will not rebuild the home of his brother. So we'll say, if you notice, by the way, the Torah used lashon of singular, beis ochiv. As in Yibum, you rebuild 1 home, you don't rebuild 2 homes. Gzeres hakosov. Okay, so I understand I can't do Yibum with both. Why can't the surviving brother, why can't Shimon do chalitza with both? Beis chalutz hanal. The pasuk calls by chalitza, literally again the home, singular of chalutz hanal. Bayis echad du chalitz, you only do chalitza with 1 bayis, ve'in chalitz shnei batim. So I'll say, interestingly enough, it's the same drasha. The Gemara seems to indicate over here that halacha l'maisa, because in both yibum and chalitza, the Torah uses the singular lashon of bayis, home, singular, indicating to me only yibum with 1 woman, only chalitza with 1 woman. So I have a great idea. Let me do yibum with 1 and chalitza with the other. Right? Isn't that easy? Amakra imlo yachbots. Chafetz yavam kol ola liyibum ola lechalitza kol she'ein ola liyibum ein ola lechalitza. So we've seen this drasha before as well. That halacha l'maisa yibum and chalitza are 2 sides of the same coin. So when do you do chalitza? Only when there's a possibility of yibum, and when is there a mitzvah of yibum? Only when there's a possibility of chalitza. So therefore I will say again, once I know I can't do yibum with both, therefore what? I cannot do chalitza with both. And therefore we go back to the previous drasha. Bayis, Torah speaks about again the home, singular, indicating to me that yibum and or chalitza, or yibum or chalitza, are only done with 1 of the women. Va'od, furthermore, shelo yomru bayis miktaso banoi u miktaso chalutz. Furthermore, we're going to say we don't want people saying that Reuven's home, Reuven is the one brother who passed away, part of it is built and part of it is chalutz. The yomru, I don't understand, who cares? Let people say that. Here's the problem we'll say. It miyabim hader chalutz hachanami. Ela dilma chalutz hader miyabim v'kam le below yivne. See, I will say, the truth is, if you want, you could do yibum and then chalitza, right? I will say, why can you do? So imagine for a moment again. Reuven passes away, and Shimon decides he's going to do Yibum with Rachel and Chalitza with Leah. I will say, is that okay? Is it okay? The answer is technically yes. Why? Because Lamaisa, after he does Yibum with Rachel, the Chalitza with Leah is really what? Inconsequential. So, look, if you want to do that, that's fine. But what are we concerned about both sides? See, the opposite would be problematic. Why? Because if Reuven were to go ahead and do Chalitza with Rachel, and then do Yibum with Leah, now we've got a problem. Why? Because after he's done Chalitza, I will say, what has he effectively done? He's severed any level of permissible relationship with his sisters-in-law. So once he does Chalitza with Rachel, if he now does what he thinks is Yibum with Leah, that's not Yibum. That's like, you know what that's called? You know what that's called? Eshesach. Right? That's called marrying your brother's wife, which is an erva. So therefore, that's why we're concerned, and that's why we don't want him doing things with two wives, with both of the widows, even though technically there's a way to do it. Maybe we should say like this. Maybe the mitzvah of Yibum only applies where there's one widow, but maybe where there are two widows, right? Because you also remember again, the entire drasha, right? The entire drasha, how do we know that halacha l'maisa, at the end of the day, you only do Yibum with one wife? Because the Torah uses the lashon of bias, singular. And how do we know that you only do Chalitza with one wife? Torah uses lashon of bias, singular. To which leads the Gemara to float an interesting suggestion. So maybe we should say that the only time that there is a mitzvah of Yibum is when there's one widow. But maybe once there's two widows, maybe there's no mitzvah. I was supposed to say two widows from who? Two widows from who? Two widows from the same brother. Maybe there's no mitzvah of Yibum in that kind of case. To which the Gemara says, Im came, Saras erva da aser achmona lamali. I will say, here's the problem. If that's the case, then what was the point of the first Mishnah of the Masechta? I will say, remember again, what was the first Mishnah of the Masechta? Saras erva, where you have two wives, right? Brother Reuven passes away. He leaves behind two wives, Rachel and Leah. Rachel is an erva to Shimon. And we went through that whole discussion where the impact of being the co-wife of an erva. But if the mitzvah of Yibum does not apply in a case where there are two widows, how do you ever have the case of Tsaras erva? To which the Gemara says, Hashta, Beis ba'alma amart lav b'nei chalitza v'yibum ninhu. If you're going to tell me that in general, two women are not, right, when there are two wives, they're not subject to Yibum and chalitza. So Tsaras erva miboy. Then would a case of Tsaras erva even be shayach? As the Gemara says, Alam, maybe not. You could have said as follows, Erva abroi kaima. Perhaps I would have thought that in a case of Erva, she stands on the outside. In other words, she's not even in the Yibum construct. Vitis yabim tzarasa, and therefore maybe her co-wife should be subject to Yibum. Kamash malon da'asira eli yivimto riba. Teri Czinn says, you're right. Again, kamash malon that the Erva prohibits her tzara, as we've seen. So we'll say, how do you know that the mitzvah of Yibum applies even when there are multiple wives who are widowed? In other words, even though the deceased brother was married to multiple wives, yivimto. We'll say Torah used the double lashon of yivimto to teach us that even if the deceased brother was married to multiple wives, ultimately the mitzvah of Yibum / Chalitza devolves upon all of them. So we'll say, this is a very, very, very important Gemara. Because the Mishnah taught me the halacha that when Reuven passes away, leaves behind one widow, the mitzvah of Yibum / Chalitza is performed with one of the women. And once you do that with one of the women, the other co-wife is exempted, no longer has anything else she has to do. How do we know that? I will say the answer is bias. Singular lashon of bias indicates to us that Yibum is only done with one, Chalitza is only done with one, and that's it. How do we know that? So we'll say, but again, based on that, I might have thought that therefore the mitzvah of Yibum only applies when it's one widow, and perhaps again, halacha l'maisa, if there are multiple widows. Perhaps there's no mitzvah of Yibum, Yevimto. The double lashon Yevimto teaches us that even when there are multiple widows, there's still a mitzvah of Yibum or Chalitza, but that mitzvah is performed only with one of those women. Incredible. The say the Mishnah then ended off, Haisa achaz kshera. So I will say, Salach l'maisa, again, the Mishnah said, if let's say Shimon is going to do Chalitza, he should do it with the wife where the Chalitza has the lowest impact. So, for example, again, Rachel, let's say this was Rachel's second marriage to Ruvain, versus Leah, where it was her first marriage. So, we'll say, which tells us Rachel is already a grusha. Right? Remember, she was divorced from her previous marriage to Yaakov. Then she married Ruvain. She's already a grusha. So now, Shimon, if you're going to do chalitza anyway, do chalitza with Rachel, because this way, again, her status doesn't really change. And don't do chalitza with Leah, because if you do chalitza with Leah, you're going to turn into a chalutza, and ultimately, again, that would preclude her from marrying into the kahuna, to which the Gemara is supposed to listen to this. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said, Kan Shana Rebbe. So here, Rebbe said the statement, Lo yishpoch adam meiboro v'achirim tzrichim lahem. Rebbe said, a person should not spill out the water in his pit or the water in his bucket if other people need it. Others are both saying, what does this mean? You may be finished with the water. You may not need it anymore. But don't spill out perfectly good water that other people could get benefit from. Which I will say means, essentially, this is like Bal Tashchis. Do not engage in unnecessary waste. So I'll say, so the Gemara says over here, why make Leah a chalutza if you don't have to? Right now she's a widow, and as a widow, Rabbi will say, who could she marry? As a widow, who could she marry? Anyone. Okay, so the only person she can't marry is who? Is the Kohen Gadol. Can't marry the Kohen Gadol, right? Kohen Gadol has to marry B'sula. Can't marry Kohen Gadol. Okay, fine. One man she can't marry. Fine. But Lamaisa, again, anyone else she can. So why go ahead and unnecessarily impact her if you don't have to? So I'll say there's a whole interesting discussion over here about halacha lemaisa, whether or not there's a din of bal tashchis. Is there a din of wasting? We have general din of bal tashchis. The biblical concept of bal tashchis comes with the destruction of fruit trees. Right in Parshas Kiseitze, Torah says when you go out to war, Torah says don't destroy trees. Don't destroy fruit trees. Right? And that's Bal Tashchis. If you need it strategically, you could go in and destroy it. So I will say this becomes the biblical prohibition of like wanton destruction, unnecessary destruction. Which is interesting, I will say, because you see this happening now. You see that, like in this newest front between the war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia's clearly using like a scorched earth policy. They're destroying everything. In Judaism, we don't believe, right? And Jewish army does not utilize a scorched earth policy. We do not do that. That's Baltai. Whatever you have to destroy for the sake of winning the battle, destroy. But Lamaisa, destruction for the sake of destruction, we do not do. So there's a whole discussion here. And they're both saying, we kind of, this goes forward. You can't unnecessarily rip your clothing. That's Bal Tashchis. You can't waste food, Bal Tashchis. Interesting discussion as to whether or not the prohibition of Bal Tashchis applies to water. I'm drinking a cup of water. I finished the water. Can I just pour it out? So there's a whole discussion over here based on this Gemara as to whether or not Bal Tashchis applies to water. I will say, what I will tell you something else, a little bit, B'derech Hashkafa, Mayim, water, also represents Torah. It represents Torah. So there's also a beautiful metaphor in this, right? Lo yishpoch adam mei boro va'achirim tzrichim lo. See, I will say, a person possesses Torah, a person possesses ruchnius. And you might say, okay, so me, I'm good, I have enough. If you have what to give, and if you have what to share, and you don't share it, that's the equivalent of pouring out your water on the ground. So Rabbi says, if you have Torah to share, you have Torah to give, don't keep it to yourself, because keeping it for yourself is the equivalent of just pouring it out. But make sure to take your ruchnius and share it with others. Failure to take what you have, what you possess, and share it with other people is Bal Tashchis, is unfortunately unnecessary waste. Incredible. I will say Mishnah. No good Mishnah, no? Great. Incredible. Let's go right there. So listen to this. So we'll say a person who goes out and remarries his divorcee. So just to be clear, the case we're talking about over here is Ruvain divorces Rachel, and then what happens? She marries someone else in the interim, right? Then she gets divorced, and now Ruvain remarries her. Isser da'oraisa, you're not allowed to do that. Or Hanosi chalutzaso, or Reuven does chalitza with Rachel. We'll just keep it easy. Reuven does chalitza with Rachel and then marries her afterwards. Or no say krovas chalutzaso. Or Reuven does chalitza with Rachel and then marries a relative of Rachel. All of these cases prohibited. Now, I will say the difference is machzer grushaso and ultimately again no say chalutzaso. All right, are both going to be da'oraisos. No say krovas chalutza, so marrying the relative of the woman with whom you did chalitza is a d'Rabbanan. We'll get to this in the Gemara. What's the halacha? Yotzi v'avlad mamzer Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva says you have to divorce these women, and any children born from this union, right, are all mamzerim. Wow. The Chum say ein havlad mamzer. The Chum say none of the marriage is aser, but the offspring are not mamzerim. Mod benose krovas grushaso shavlad mamzer. And the Chachamim agree, however, that if you marry, so we'll say, let's say again in this case, where Reuven divorced Rachel, and then goes in and marries one of her close relatives. Let's say he goes and he marries her mother or her sister. The Chacham will agree in that case that the offspring from that union are mamzerim. Says the Gemara of Sara Rabbi Akiva, hanose krovas chalutzaso avlad mamzer. Is that true? We'll say at the end of the day, Rabbi Akiva holds that, let's say again, Reuven does chalitza with Rachel, and then he marries Rachel's sister afterwards, that the offspring is a mamzer. Va'amar Rosh Lakish will say first, why line Kanshan Rabbi, achos grusha midivrei Torah, achas chalutza midivrei Sofrim. So Rabbi will say, marrying the immediate relative of a woman who you divorced, that's an Issa D'Oraisa. Marrying the relative of a woman whom you did chalitza to, that's an Isser D'Rabbanan. So Rabbi will say, we understand the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva holds that whenever you marry someone where the relationship is an Isser D'Oraisa, that union creates mamzerim. But Rabbi Akiva say that by an Isser D'Rabbanan. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Tani, krovas gerusha. So you're right. Rather, again, I will say, the Mishnah should read that according to Rabbi Akiva, if you divorce a woman and then marry one of her immediate relatives, according to Rabbi Akiva, the offspring of that union are mamzerim. So read it as krovas gerushaso, not as krovas chalutzaso. Because krovas chalutzaso will only be in Isser D'Rabbanan, therefore does not produce mamzerus. Hachanayim Starber, it seems to be clear, Diktani Seifa, Umodim benose krovas grushaso shavlad mamzer. The Chachamim agree with Rabbi Akiva that if you marry the relative of your divorcee, immediate relative, that the offspring is a mamzer. So okay, if Rabbi Akiva himself is also talking about the case of krovas gerushaso, then hainu diktani umodim. Then it makes sense that the Mishnah reads and the rabbis admit or agree. But if you hold that ultimately again, Rabbi Akiva is not talking about krovas gerushaso, so my modim, then what does modim mean? So maybe you'll say that the entire point of the Mishnah is to teach us that ultimately again, if there is a union that is punishable by kares, the offspring of that union are mamzerim. Hakatani le'lekaman. We already learned that later on. What do we learn later on? Ezuhu mamzer. Rabbi say, who's a mamzer? Kol she'er basar shubalo yavo. Rabbi say, Rabbi Kiva says, mamzerus comes from any relationship punishable by a lav, which Rabbi say is a very, very, very strict standard. Rabbi Shimon HaTimni says, Kol shechayav alav karis b'dei shamayim. Rabbi Shimon HaTimni, which is how we paskin, that no. Mamzerus only comes from a relationship punishable by kares, not by a lav. The Gemara says, "V'alochal kidvarav," and we paskin like Rabbi Shimon HaTimni. So the Gemara says, "V'dilma kasasim la'tanik Rabbi Shimon HaTimni." Maybe a whole point of our Mishnah is just coming to reflect the Rabbi Shimon HaTimni. Imkain listni sha'ar chayve krisos. If that's the case of Osai, then the Mishnah should list other cases of chayve krisos. Krovas gerushaso lamali. Rabbi said the case of krovas gerushaso, as much as it's an Isser D'Oraisa, it's not kares, right? Rabbi said if you divorce a woman and then marry her sister or marry her mother, that is an Isser D'Oraisa. It's not an Isser kares. To which the Gemara says, Elishmamina Ayriba. Rather, Rabbi says what we said before. It must be Rabbi Akiva is talking about a case of krovas gerushaso, not krovas chalusaso. According to Rabbi Akiva, if you marry the immediate relative of the woman who you divorced, that is an Isser D'Oraisa. And again, according to Rabbi Akiva, if you marry this woman, ultimately the offspring will be a mamzer. To which the Gemara says, To which the Gemara says, good. El Shaina Ayriba. So the Gemara says, V'dilma li olam lo Ayriba. Maybe not. So the Gemara says, V'aydi de Tana Machzir Grushaso v'nosei Chalutzaso, Krovas Chalutzaso. Tani Nami Krovas Grushaso. I will say, maybe once we're talking about over here, Machzir Grushaso, Nosei Chalutzaso, Krovas Chalutzaso. We added in here also, Krovas Grushaso. The Krovas Chalutzaso Rabbi Akiva have a mamzer. So also, you're going to suggest that if a man does chalitza with a woman, and then what? Goes ahead and does chalitza with her, and then marries her relative, that according to Rabbi Akiva, that's going to create mamzera. So both say that's a real stretch. Because remember again, marrying the relative of the woman with whom you did chalitza is an isur derabanan. So to say that such a union will create mamzeros is very strong. On Rabbi Chiba Abba, on Rabbi Yochanan, Hani from Rabbi Akiva, Damakra, base chalutz hanal. I will say, what would Rabbi Akiva's logic be? He would say, look, the Torah, after you do chalitza, I will say, what does the Torah call this woman? Base chalutz hanal, the home of the removed shoe. Hakasav kira'o bayis. I will say, what do you see? The Torah calls a chalutza a bayis. A bayis. I will say, what does bayis represent? Bayis represents a wife. A wife, right? A marital unit. So the fact that the Torah calls the chalutza ultimately, again, a bayis, indicates to us that there is an erva status associated with that. To which Rabbi Yosef says, everyone agrees that if a man remarries his divorcee, Shavlad Pagum Lakahuna, that ultimately the offspring is Pagum. So I will say, now we're being introduced to something a little bit different. So now let's go back to the previous case. Reuven was married to Rachel. He divorces Rachel. Rachel marries another man, Yaakov. Then Rachel gets divorced from that man. Now Reuven remarries Rachel. I will say that is an Isser D'Oraisa. So remember again, according to Rabbi Akiva, children from that union will be mamzerim. According to the Rabbanon, they're not going to be mamzerim. So what are they? So now the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef and then Rishim and Berebi, everyone agrees that if you remarry your divorcee after she's been married to someone else, Havlad Pagum L'Kahuna. The child is blemished. The offspring is blemished L'Kahuna. So what does it mean blemished? Rashi says over here, Shavlad Pagum, top Rashi, Mem Dalam Abeis, Vim Yolda Bas Psul L'Kahuna Kichalala. We'll say, what does it mean? Listen to this. This impact is really only felt on girls, not really felt on boys. That Allah Chalamaysa, if they have a girl, that girl is not permitted to marry into the kahuna. So it's what's called pogum, Rabbi say, right? So again, she can marry anyone else she wants, but she cannot marry a Kohen. So the Gemara says, Mana kol modim, who is the everyone who agrees? Shimon Timni. It's Shimon Timni. The Afagabdam Shimon Timni, Ein Mamzer Mechavi Lavin, even though Shimon Timni normally holds that what? That Allah Chalamaysa, a marital union, a marriage prohibited by a lav, does not create mamzerus, right? Nehi de mamzelo havi, pagum miha havi. Even though, again, the offspring will not be a mamzer, the offspring will be pagum. And I will say what pagum simply means is, if it's a girl, she can't marry a Kohen. If it's a boy, what does pagum mean? What does pagum mean? Nothing. So Lamaisa, right? Lamaisa, what it might mean is, I don't know, maybe people will have a yichus problem, right? But Lamaisa, it doesn't impact his marriage pool. To which the Gemara says, listen to this. The Gemara says, Mikav v'chomer me'amona. It's a kav v'chomer from amona. Ma'amona the Kohen Gadol, sheni sur shav bakol, pagum, both say, and amona, ultimately again, who is only usher to the, right? Who is only usher to Kohen Gadol, right? And amona, she's not usher to anyone other than a Kohen Gadol. Right? What's the halacha? Sheni surah shavakol bina pagum. If she does, right, her offspring ultimately again is pagum. Zu, this woman, machzir grushasa woman, she surah shavakol. Right? Because we'll say no one is permitted to remarry their divorcee after she's married someone else. Eino din shabina pagum. All the more so, all her offspring should be pagum. Ikalamifrak, to which the Gemara says kavachomer is not a good kavachomer. Mala amana shekin hi atzma mischalalas. And Amana herself, when she marries the Kohen Gadol, she herself becomes piguma, so to speak. She becomes a halala. Va'od hito eva ksiv ve'in banei tovin. Further, we're going to say the pasuk is lashon of to'eva he. She becomes disqualified, but not her offspring. Va'od tanya. Furthermore, we learned hamachzer grushaso va'nose chalutzaso va'nose kruvas chalutzaso. Furthermore, we learned in the Brisa, if a man remarries his divorcee, or ultimately remarries his chalutza, or marries the immediate relative of his chalutza, Rabbi Akiva, or Rabbi Akiva says, in lo ba kiddushin, ve'ino tzrich himene get, vehi psula vlada v'vlada pasal. Rabbi Akiva holds, I will say, see, Rabbi Akiva also holds that kiddushin is not tovsin b'chai ve'elavin. He holds that kiddushin doesn't even take effect where it is biblically prohibited. And therefore, Allah Rabbi Akiva holds in all of these cases, ultimately what? There's no kiddushin. Because there's no kiddushin, you don't need a get to dissolve the union. The woman herself is psula, and her offspring are pasal. The kofin osa lahotzi. And we force a man to go ahead and not live with any of these women. The Chum say just the opposite. First of all, yesh lo kiddushin. I will say the Chum of the opinion that Allah, when you have a marriage that is punishable by a lav, kiddushin is tovsin. Even though the marriage is asr, right, the marriage takes effect. Utzrichim and a get, and therefore to dissolve the union, what do you need? You need a divorce. Vehi kshera, ultimately again, she is kshera, right? She is permitted, right? She herself is permitted. Vlada kasher, and her offspring is permitted. So what's the Gemara says? Laman. When we say permitted to who? Lav lekahuna, is it not permitted to the kahuna? Lo lekal. No, I will say, can't marry into the kuna, but who can they marry into? Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael, right? They're not disqualified ultimately again from Klal Yisrael. To which the Gemara says, Ihachi, if that's the case, he ksheira laman. So we'll say, so you're telling me now, the children ultimately again are permitted to come into the Klal Yisrael. Ihachi, he ksheira laman. If that's the case, when we say that she is ksheira, who is she kshera to? Sheileimah lekal, if you want to say in the Klal Yisrael, pshita, that's obvious. Mishum dezanya afsi lekal, because she engaged in an illicit relationship, she's not allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael. It doesn't make sense. Elalav lekahuna, rather it must be into the kahuna. Umidihi lekahuna, vlada nami lekuna, and if she's permitted to marry into the kahuna, her offspring should also be permitted to marry into the kahuna. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Midei area, hakidisa v'hakidisa. Maybe not. Maybe we just say that ultimately, again, she's treated one way, and her children are treated a different way. In other words, we'll say, what we're pointing out over here is, we assumed up until this point that whatever the status of the woman is going to be the status of the children. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Maybe ultimately, again, you could have a situation where, although the mother engaged in an illicit relationship, she may still be permitted to the kahuna, whereas her children are not permitted into the kahuna. To which the Gemara says, I'm sorry, this seems to be correct. Tani Risha, he psula, vlada pasal. She is pasal and her offspring is pasal. He psula laman, she is disqualified. I will say, for who? There's an ilema lekal, if you want to say it's the Klal Yisrael, mishum dezano, ifsale, because she committed an act of zchus, she wouldn't be permitted to marry to Klal Yisrael. It doesn't make any sense. The Gemara says, "Ela lav lekahuna." Rather, it must be that she is psula. Ultimately, again for the kahuna, vlada pasal, and we say that her offspring is pasal. Aman ilema lekahuna. If you want to say this to the kahuna, halakal kasher. Ultimately, before the kal shall be kasher. Amar Rabbi Kiva havlad mamja ela pshita lekal. Rather, I must say to the kal umidereisha kedisa v'kedisa seifa nami hakedisa v'hakedisa. Because we're just pointing out over there that Allah Lamaisa, as tempting as it is to go ahead and say that whatever is the status of the mother, legabe the kahuna is the status of the children. That's not necessarily the case. The Gemara says the hita eva nami hita eva and sarasat eva ava banea tovin. So I will say rather, what will we say? The pasuk says to'ivahi, she will be an abomination, but ultimately again not her koiv. In tzarasa to'iva aval baneh tovin, but her children ultimately again will be stuck in the same status with her. Ella almana kasha, I what do you do with almana? Mala almana shakini aswa mischaleles. So we'll say rather, here's how you have to go ahead and frame this. So we'll stop over here for today. I apologize, we did that last piece quickly. We'll pick up with the Ella itmar haki itmar tomorrow. And we'll say, so again, where we're left with just right now, just what we're left with is, we've got Rabbi Akiva saying that halacha l'maisa, even isurei lav, create mamzerus. That's what we've got from Rabbi Akiva. We've got the Chachamim disagreeing. The only case that Chachamim seem to agree is in the case of machzir grushaso, where Allah Chalamayis again, if you remarry your divorcee, that could potentially go ahead and create mamzerus. I will say Shimon Timni telling us that Allah Chalamayis, the only problematic case is an Isser Kares. That's what creates mamzerus, but anything other than that does not. And Mir Hashem, the resolution of this sugya tomorrow. Shkach, I will say. All right, a good night, everyone. Chaver Zuma, good night.